Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the podcast. Here we are again, and I'm so thrilled to have you all here with me. What are you doing right now? Are you out for a run? Are you driving a car? Are you going for a walk? Are you at the gym? Are you exercising? I'm so curious. I tend to listen to podcasts all the time, and sometimes I'm doing it while I'm doing dishes, or wrapping up a workout, or anyway, just kind of curious. So listen, friends, here we are, and today I wanted to dive into a topic that I find is really helpful for my students and for me too, and it's really understanding why our negative thought patterns continue to exist even after we have awareness around them, and how to rewire our brain so we stop having those negative thought patterns. And you'll see the title of this podcast episode specifically speaks to guilt, imposter syndrome, and insecurity, but it's really any negative thought pattern. I put those in because those are the ones that, in my experience, my clients tend to experience consistently, a lot of them. And that was mine too, guilt and imposter syndrome. So, we're going to talk about that today. And of course, before I jump in, here's my request. If you have not yet left a review, it would really mean a lot to me if you could just pause the episode really quick and rate this podcast and leave a review. It does not have to be long, it can be short and simple, but ratings and reviews help other people find the podcast. So, it would be really, really helpful if you could do that. All right, let us jump in. So, we are breaking down this podcast in this way. I'm going to talk about the science behind all of these things, like why these negative thought patterns continue to persist. And then I'm going to give you some actual tangible steps because that's my jam. I like to make sure that you walk away with something that you can actually start to do so that you fix these problems. All right, so let me just give you the dirty, the skinny on how this affected me. So I was raised with, this belief of guilt. That guilt meant that I cared is how I disentangled it in my brain after many, many, many years of being coached myself. And what I realized is, depending on how you were raised, how you were socialized, how your parents dealt with guilt, were you raised in a house with a lot of religion, so on and so forth, you have likely inherited some thoughts. And by likely, I mean you have inherited thoughts and feelings, and some of them no longer serve you. For me, it was guilt, and guilt was so pervasive. I felt guilty about everything. I felt guilty, and I was afraid of disappointing people. Hello, people pleaser. And the guilt was so interesting. The dishes weren't done. I felt guilty. I was like 2 seconds late to pick up my kids. Guilt, 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 guilt. And it's fascinating how it really showed up big in my life and really got in the way of me having an intentional life until I really started to dismantle it. And even after I started getting coaching on it, it felt like a broken record in my brain. Like it felt like the soundtrack in my brain with this thought feeling combination of guilt and imposter syndrome continuing to play, even after I had awareness, even after I had some of these tools. And so I really had to dig down deep to figure out what is it that I need to do to rewire my brain. And so I did that for myself and I started doing it for my students. And lo and behold, of course, it works because it's backed by science and by evidence. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start as to like, why do these negative thought patterns continue to persist? Even when you have already shined a light on them, even when you already know, yes, I feel like an imposter in this setting. Yes, I feel really guilty when this happens. Why does it keep happening? You have the awareness already. Why does it keep happening? So there are three big reasons. Number one, we're going to talk about the science behind recurring thoughts first. So here's the thing about thought loops. And it's not just thought loops, it's also neuroplasticity and thought loops. So the brain's habit forming mechanism. So what it does is it reinforces repetitive negative thoughts. When we repeatedly think, for example, guilt or insecurity based thoughts, those neural pathways for those patterns, they strengthen. They get stronger, 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 and eventually they become automatic responses. And the brain's habit circuit, so kind of like the brain's autopilot, which is found in the basal ganglia, what it does is it will perpetuate the cycle. And the habit building part of the brain, or the habit circuit, it's awesome. It really serves us because it's a short circuit for the brain. So what it does is, like, when you're learning how to ride a bike, for example, it's hard in the beginning and then it gets really easy. Then you're good at it. Then you don't have to think about it anymore. So that's the habit part of the brain. So it's great because it saves you a lot of time, energy, and effort, which effort requires a ton of energy from your brain. So it saves that effort so you don't have to think about it anymore. You can just do it. The problem is, it also works for negative habits, including thoughts and feelings. And because the thoughts and feelings now bypass the conscious part of our brain, it automatically goes on and triggers that neural pathway between the negative thought and negative feeling combination. So it just happens automatically, which super stinks, by the way, unless you have awareness into it and you can redo it, which is what you're going to get to do today. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about the kind of this like autopilot of the brain, the habit circuit of the brain. So the reason why I want to talk about this is because I think it's really important for you to understand how habits form. So these negative thought patterns form like all habits form, and habits have essentially three parts to form. There has to be a cue, there has to be a routine, and there has to be a reward. For example, let's say there's a habit you have which you hate, which is you always eat cookies when you see them around. So if we were going to put that into the cue, routine, reward, what would it be? The cue is you see the cookie. The routine, you eat the cookie. The reward, there's sugar in your body, which secretes dopamine, feels great. So cue, routine, reward. Okay. So the more you go through the cycle, the stronger that habit becomes, because if you think about it, it's just like becoming such a strong pathway. Those neuronal connections are becoming really strong. So how does it work for negative thoughts? So, and what is actually the reward? Like, why is there's no reward for the negative thought, or you may think. So what's actually happening? So what's happening is this. So let's see. For example, I'm going to give you me and guilt. My cue, for example, this is something that I've actively been working through, which is I feel guilty sometimes when my girlfriends want to go on a trip and it has nothing related to work. It's not at all related to anything professional. It's just for fun. I feel a tremendous amount of guilt. And so the cue is I get an email from my girlfriends telling me about a girl trip. The routine, so here's my routine. My routine is I automatically go to my calendar. And what I start to do when I go to my calendar is I start to look for all of the reasons why I can't go. I look for any professional trips I have to take, any other travel, stuff like that. And my reward is, so then I say to myself, oh, I can't do that. I need to spend time with my family, or look at all this time I've been traveling. So my reward, and this, by the way, is what we call a false reward. It's not an actual reward we're enjoying, but our brain is telling us, hey, it's a reward. So what's my reward? My reward is that then I tell myself, I'm being such a good mom, or I'm being such a good wife by saying no to this. But truthfully, what's happening is I get this invitation for a girls' trip. I immediately feel guilty. And so really it's the cue is the thought. I get this invitation. Then it's linked to that feeling, which is guilt. So then I do whatever I can to get out of it. And then I tell myself I'm actually being really good for not doing it. And again, that is just a thought. Am I really being a good mom or a good wife for not going? Who knows? That doesn't make me, I could stay here and yell at my kids all weekend. That doesn't make me a good mom. So the point is that the reward isn't real reward. It's a false reward. That's what happens with these negative thoughts and feeling combination, is that your brain somehow thinks it's helping you, but really it's a negative reward. So, or a false reward. All right, but the good news is, of course, you can teach your brain to rewire and change this habit circuit. And that's what we're going to talk about in just a bit. All right, so that's number one. So number one is the neuroplasticity and thought loops that are happening behind the scenes are creating these habits. Number two, our brain practices biases. Now, there's two big cognitive biases at play that are involved with these negative thought loops. Number one, confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is essentially where we have a thought feeling combo and we look for evidence everywhere else to confirm that these negative thoughts, this negative belief, this guilt, this imposter syndrome, that it's true. And we avoid anything to the contrary. So let's see, as an example, what I would do, for example, if I got that invitation to go on a girls' trip, I already assume that it would be a wrong thing to go because I feel guilty if I were to go. Guilt must mean that I would be doing the wrong thing if I go on this girl's trip. So what am I looking for to confirm that that's true? Any small cue to make it true. So like my husband saying anything like you've been traveling a lot or looking at me a certain way when I bring it up, looking for all these cues to confirm that I would actually be doing the wrong thing if I were to go. Now, I coach a ton of really smart, really ambitious, really motivated professionals, men and women. And I coach a lot of women that are in male dominated fields. And there are many subtle ways that sexism shows up and gets into our brains and creates imposter syndrome and insecurity in women. This I know was my story, and it's the story for a lot of women I coach, especially women in male dominated fields. And what I've noticed as a trend over and over again is the more you feel like an imposter, the more insecure you feel, the more you will try to confirm that it is true that you actually don't belong, you're not as good as or you're not as good, you're not good enough, or whatever it is, whatever story you have. So I have one client, for example, who is so brilliant and is so smart, and she keeps getting promoted and she has all this evidence, but she's not looking at that evidence. All she sees is she has this deep belief that she doesn't belong there. She feels like an imposter. So anytime she asks for anything, she's always looking for cues, reading like in people's facial cues or trying to like read the email from all these different angles. Did they really mean this or did they mean this? Always trying to read into someone else's response to prove her bias. That's cognitive bias at play. So what's the reward here? So with imposter syndrome, for many, many people, I know this was true for me and it has been for my clients, the false reward is that you believe that if you actually think that you're not good enough, it is going to motivate you to work harder. It's going to motivate you to be smarter, to get better. But friends, I have done a quadrillion episodes on self-compassion and being motivated through love, through kindness, through compassion. That is what actually gets you to succeed in life. That's what actually gets you to improve. That's what actually motivates us from a place of kindness, not this other way where we're being really mean to ourselves, because that just takes a tremendous amount of willpower. It's like your kid coming to you and being like, I didn't do well in math. And then you berating them and telling them, you suck, you're the worst. Now go study. Your kid's probably going to study, but kid's probably going to feel horrible doing it. Now, if you were to say, wow, why do you think that? Of course, that's not true. We just need to study. We'll find another way. Let's get you a tutor. And you support them and inspire them, they're more likely to do better on their next math test. Okay, so that's cognitive bias. And that type of bias is called a confirmation bias. The second type of bias is a negativity bias. Now, I've talked about this a lot, but the brain has this huge negativity bias where we constantly are looking for things that are negative 5 times more than things that are positive. Now, the human brain is wired to do this. Why? Because it's a survival mechanism. Because if we are amplifying things that are negative, we are more likely to stay alive. If we amplify, like, for example, insecurity is a good example of this. If you are not good at running away from a lion and you're amplified, like you're not good at running away from a lion, you will constantly be looking for lions everywhere, staying away from the lion because you're not going to be able to run away from them. So that's negativity bias. But it plays a role nowadays, even though we're no longer in our caveman days, we're no longer running away from anything. Guilt, insecurity, and other negative emotions still show up stronger than any positive emotions. And this is work we constantly get to do because our brain is pretty tricky. It's going to offer us negative thoughts, negative feelings all of the time. And even for me, I meditate every day, anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. And for a large part of the month of October and part of November, I was traveling a lot and I didn't have my regular meditation routine. And I noticed how easy it was for my brain to flip back into old habits, old thoughts, old feeling combinations. And I had to really pause and say, that's so interesting. I mean, now I can notice, and now I don't really engage in those negative thoughts that my brain's offering me, but it will all come back. So it's an active practice that I have decided I'm committing to for the rest of my life. All right, so that's cognitive biases. The third reason why this negative soundtrack of thoughts and feelings continue to play out in our brain is because of emotional conditioning. So what does this mean? So we all know that early life experiences will deeply embed emotional patterns in our brain. In fact, we have the most insane amount of neuroplasticity happening in our brains between 0 to 7 years old. Some people even say up to 10 years old. So if you experience criticism, rejection, feeling like you weren't loved, liked, accepted between ages of 0 and 10, that SHIT imprints in your brain and creates deep subconscious beliefs of unworthiness. If between 0 and 10, you were told, you saw examples of like people always playing the guilt card on you or telling you you should feel guilty or you should feel ashamed, you might notice that you're constantly feeling guilt and shame now for things that don't require that anymore. And this isn't just our lived experience. So, yes, our lived experience between 0 and 10 does this, but this could also be passed down from your ancestral line through ancestral or generational trauma, which, by the way, is a huge way that imposter syndrome or insecurity stems or shows up for us. Maybe you never had an experience of not feeling worthy or not feeling like you belonged, but you had ancestors that felt that and they got passed down in your lineage. It can get passed down from up to 3 to 7 generations before you. So you may not even have met the ancestor that experienced that, but those genetics got passed down to you through epigenetics, and that's how it's showing up for you. So, those are the three biggest reasons why it's really hard for us to turn off that soundtrack in our brain. All right, so let's shift and talk about some actual solutions here. Now, there are three simple steps to break the cycle. They're simple, my friends, but they are not easy. So we have to be aware of them and we have to be committed to practicing them if we want to break these cycles. All right, step number one is awareness. Of course, it's awareness. First of all, you got to want to notice the cycle and change it, or else there's no point. So I didn't even mention that, but that's like pre step one. So that's like step zero. Step zero, you got to want to change. Step one, awareness. You have to know the negative thought feeling combo exists. But friends, awareness isn't enough. I've had so many really brilliant, really smart, high achieving, successful clients that come to me who've experienced childhood trauma. Now they know the trauma exists. They know it's there. They have insight into it. Maybe they've even seen a few therapists, but they still have not worked through the way that stuff is affecting them. And it's getting in the way of them fully actualizing. So we can be aware of the trauma, but if we haven't fully worked through it, processed it, healed from whatever we need to heal from, it's still going to affect us in ways that are unbeknownst to us because it's in subconscious and habitual parts of our brain. So this is the way I think about awareness. Awareness is like a flashlight. It turns on the light onto the problem. But awareness does not cause rewiring. It doesn't rewire the neural pathways. And let me just give you an analogy really quick. It might be a silly analogy, but I really like it. So the way I think about neural pathways rewiring is like a road being built. So if you're going to construct a new road, let's say there's like a big jungle out there and you want to construct a new road, you got to come out and you got to see it. You have to like be aware that you want to make the road. You got to see it. So you turn on the lights. That's awareness. Step one, awareness. But step two, you got to actually cut down whatever's in the way and come out and pave it and make sure that the weeds don't grow back. So you have to maintain the road as well. And that's really step two, which is why awareness is not enough, because awareness just turns on the light. It doesn't actually pave the new highway. It doesn't actually rewire the road. And remember, a lot of our habits, depending on how old you are, have been around our entire life 30, 40, 50 years, some for 10 years, some for 5 years. So even if they've only been around for 1 year, that's a really well-formed neural pathway, which means we need to do our work to repave a new pathway. Awareness is not enough. Now, I mentioned this because I often see so many of my clients where they have the awareness and it feels awesome. It's like this huge aha moment, and I see their face light up and they're like, oh, of course. And those aha moments feel so good. Feels like a little mini orgasm in the brain. And then they think that, okay, I had this aha moment. Awesome. I'm good. I'm done. I'm going to be able to go and change that habit. And then they get discouraged because it doesn't work that way. It's not that easy. You can have the awareness, but you have to take the steps to change the habits, to change the actions. So awareness is not enough. And what can sometimes happen is once you have the awareness and you notice that you're not changing, and you notice that the habits aren't going away, it feels even worse because now you see the awareness and you see you're still taking the action, and then you get mad at yourself because you haven't changed. So again, awareness is the first step, but you need more than awareness, sweet friends. You need more than awareness. This was, I think, my biggest sticking point in the beginning. Especially when I started working with coaches, especially really good coaches that would catch all these things and give me all these aha moments. I was like, great. But then I still noticed my difficulty setting boundaries, my still fear of disappointing people, the guilt I was feeling, all of that stuff. And I'm like, man, come on. Why am I not getting better? Why am I not improving? Again, awareness is not enough. All right. So, underneath step one, I kind of call this step 1A, not step two yet, but underneath step one, sometimes what can help is if you have compassionate curiosity as to why that thought feeling combination exists. What is the root cause? And I'm very intentional here when I say compassionate curiosity. We want to understand that whatever thought feeling we're experiencing, it was there created by us to really help us, to protect us. Our brain does those types of things because it thinks it's really helpful. It thinks, thinks it's really rewarding us with those false rewards. It doesn't know any different. And so it doesn't help us to be mad at ourselves, to judge ourselves, to feel shame over the thought feeling combination. None of that is going to help move us forward. That's not forwarding. So having compassionate curiosity is forwarding. It is helpful because then sometimes you can find it and then you can feel neutral about why that's there. Now, sometimes you will find the root cause, but not always. And if you don't find the root cause, that's okay too. So if you don't find the root cause, it's okay. What I don't want you to do is get stuck looking for the root cause. That's a trick the mind plays. So what I mean by that is I think about one of my clients who's so smart, and so really like kind of like philosophical in her head a lot, wants to know, wants to know, wants to know. That's funny. I feel like I'm talking about myself, but I'm not. I'm talking about a client, but I guess I could use myself as an example too, because I can get there too, like that. And what I realize is sometimes needing to know the root cause is a trick. It's just like a silly trap the mind is playing on us to keep us from growing or from healing or from releasing what's really uncomfortable. Because sometimes that thought feeling combination, again, it's like this really well formed pathway. It is so well known to us. It feels comfortable and it's hard to let it go. And instead of letting it go, we stay stuck trying to figure out why, instead of being like, okay, I might not know why, but I'm ready to release it. And that right there can feel so uncomfortable, being ready to release it, especially if you're someone that always has answers. If you have controlling tendencies because of whatever reasons, it can feel really hard to release. So I just want to share that with you because having compassionate curiosity is awesome. Sometimes you'll know the root cause. And if you don't, it's okay because likely the root cause is multifactorial. It's likely because of a lot of reasons, maybe lived experience, maybe ancestral trauma, maybe cultural, maybe societal expectations, socialisms, all those kinds of things. So there's a lot of reasons why this could have happened. And it's really hard sometimes to do that on your own, to find the root cause by yourself. Sometimes you do have to do it with the coach. They've got to poke holes in what your thoughts are. So if you have a coach, that's a really good thing to work on. And if you don't have a coach, come work with me. I will be your coach. I will help you do this. Okay, so step one, awareness. Step 1A, compassionate curiosity. Step two. So, okay, now we have the awareness. How do we actually make the change? So, I like to call this cognitive restructuring. Okay, so cognitive restructuring is actual neural rewiring. This is how we start rewiring our brain. What you want to do is you want to replace the negative thought feeling, that construct that you've created, with an evidence based difference. So, you want to challenge it and do something else. So, for example, if you experience a ton of imposter syndrome and you are always thinking, I'm not good enough to be here, instead of thinking about that, let's pause for a second. And I want to ask you, what is actually true? Where are you? Where do you have strengths? Where are you like actually good at your job? And once you can see that it's not actually black and white, it's not that I'm not always not good enough. There's sometimes I am. Then you can replace that thought with, I have some strengths and I'm getting better, or I have some strengths and I also have areas for growth like everyone else. So just notice how you can start rewiring by just changing that black and white thought you have, like, I feel guilty or whatever it is, to This is what I experience. And so I have some strengths and I'm getting better. And notice what we're practicing here. What are we practicing? Good old growth mindset. And growth mindset is awesome because that term that Carol Dweck coined, growth mindset, a long time ago in her book and her research, what she was actually referring to, like, you're actually continuing to grow as a person, as a professional. You're learning new skills, all these types of things. And I think about it as like your brain is literally growing new pathways. So when you practice growth mindset, you are literally growing neural pathways in your brain. And that is good for you. So for me, something I started doing is I started by just accepting the fact that sometimes the thought feeling combination of guilt was going to show up. So when it did, I would just say, it's okay that I'm feeling guilt. And then I would say, just because I'm feeling guilt, it doesn't make it true. Or just because that thought is showing up, it doesn't make it true. And that for me was enough to come back to a place of intentionality and mindfulness and choose what I wanted to think and feel on purpose. So I want you guys to do that for yourself. Start noticing what thoughts are creating that feeling, or start with the feeling. Like, I feel like the feeling I want to break is insecurity, it's imposter syndrome, it's guilt, whatever it is. Work backwards. What are some of like the thematic thoughts that show up? Maybe it's as simple as I'm not good enough at work. Or for me, it's like I can't do anything outside of work or family because then I would feel guilty. Oh, brain, sneaky, sneaky brain. And so start noticing what are the thought feeling combos, and then ask yourself, what is actually true here? Because what you want to do is you want to replace those thoughts with thoughts that you can actually believe. It's really important to replace the thoughts with something you can actually believe. A lot of coaches, well, I won't say a lot, but a lot of people, what I have seen do is try to go from some thought that you've been thinking for 40 plus years, replace it to something you just can't believe. Like, no, I'm awesome. I'm perfect. I'm great here, or whatever it is. And if you can't believe the thought, it's going to be really hard because your brain will not rewire if it feels like a fantasy, if it feels like something you cannot believe. But if it feels a little bit uncomfortable in your body, that's a sign that your brain is probably believing it a little bit, and neuroplasticity will happen. Okay, the last step. So step 3, when you start to rewire your brain with all of the things we just mentioned, do it with kindness, of course. You know me, compassion is the way always. Be mindful with compassion and kindness, because what you're going to need to start doing is taking action. So step 3 is really compassionate, kind actions. So sometimes what we need to do at the same time as we're rewiring the thoughts is we need to take actions that don't feel yet super comfortable, but they're going to help us break the pattern. As an example, I was asked to go out to dinner with some friends, and my guilt immediately showed up. My same thought pattern immediately showed up. And I had to say, okay, even though I'm thinking this, I know it's not true. And the action I took was to say yes to the dinner and to go out to the dinner. So you want to do both of those things at the same time. And what will happen is this: when you can do both at the same time and notice, like, for example, I went out and did dinner, and then I noticed that I was still an awesome mom. I was still super present for my kids before I went. I made sure that they had everything they needed. The next day I was present. So what I noticed is, hey, just because I'm doing this one thing does not make me a bad mom. And so what you will start to notice is you start undoing and breaking the patterns that you have already created. Same thing with the insecurity. So if you feel insecure about a skill and you want to dedicate some time to learning and practicing it, go ahead, dedicate time to learn and to practice the skill, because every time you do that, it reinforces that you are actually getting better. Now, remember, you do it from a place of, I I have some strengths and I want to get better. Not, I'm so bad at this, I need to do whatever I can. Because notice the subtle difference there. There's a different energy behind that. Okay, we covered a lot of stuff. Number 1, we talked a lot about why these negative thought patterns continue to persist, like this broken record, the soundtrack that won't turn off. Again, 3 big reasons. There's the thought loops and the neuroplasticity that gets into the habit part of the brain, the autopilot part of the brain. The 2 cognitive biases at play, confirmation bias and negativity bias. And then we talked about the emotional conditioning that can come from our lived experience, but also ancestral generational trauma. And then we talked about specific ways to break the cycle. Again, step 1, awareness. But of course, awareness isn't enough. Step 1A, compassionate curiosity to the root cause. Step 2, cognitive restructuring. So this is the actual rewiring part, which comes with replacing with thoughts that you can believe, practicing growth mindset again. And then step 3, you rewire with kindness, compassionate actions. You start taking small actions that start to prove that that thought feeling combination is not actually true. All right, friends, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Listen, if you guys are liking these types of all this content I'm putting out, I would love for you to leave me a review, to rate. If there's something else I have not covered yet, I would love to know what you want to hear. I have a ton of content that I put out all the time because I get really excited to teach. But if there's something that you all really want to hear, DM me. You can DM me on Instagram at Vanessa Calderon MD. I'm also on Facebook, same thing, Vanessa Calderon MD. So message me there. Let me know what it is you want to hear. I constantly get messages, and then I'll turn all those requests into podcast episodes for you all. So let me know what you want to hear. And thank you again for being here. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. And I will see you all next week. Adios.